but U.S. authorities arrested a man.
The FBI has seized control of a controversial website.
Shut down what's called the Silk Road.
That stunning arrest of the drug kingpin who goes by the name Dread Pirate Robert.
In 2011, a 27-year-old libertarian physicist built a secret online marketplace from his laptop. In 2 years, it processed $1.2 billion in drug sales. The FBI had no idea who he was until one small mistake changed everything. His name was Ross Ulbricht, and before he became one of the most wanted men on the internet, he was just a guy who really believed in freedom. Ross grew up in Austin, Texas. Eagle Scout, good student, the kind of kid who got straight A's without trying too hard. He went to the University of Texas at Dallas on a partial scholarship, graduated with a degree in physics, then got a master's in materials science from Penn State. By every conventional measure, this was a young man who was going places. But somewhere along the way, Ross Ulbricht had an idea, a radical one. He had been reading a lot of libertarian philosophy, economists like Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard, people who believed that the state had no right to tell you what you could put in your own body, that drug laws were not about safety, they were about control, that prohibition didn't stop anything, it just made everything more dangerous. And Ross thought, what if I could build an alternative, a free market, a truly free market, one where consenting adults could buy and sell whatever they wanted without a government intermediary, without violence, without the street corner economics that got people killed. It started as a philosophy experiment. It ended as a criminal empire. But let's back up, because to understand what Silk Road actually was and why it mattered, you first need to understand the internet it was born into. In 2011, most people used the internet the same way they used a shopping mall. You walked in through the front door. Google was your map. Amazon was your store. Facebook was where you hung out. Everything was visible, indexed, and tracked by someone. But beneath the surface internet, the one you could Google, there was something else. Something that had existed since the 1990s, but remained almost completely invisible to the average person. It was called Tor, the onion router. Tor was originally developed by the US Naval Research Laboratory to protect government communications. The idea was elegant, almost poetic. Instead of sending data in a straight line from point A to point B, where anyone watching the wire could see what you were doing, Tor wrapped your data in layers of encryption, like an onion, and bounced it through a network of volunteer-operated servers around the world. By the time your request reached its destination, it was impossible to tell who had sent it or where they were located. The government had accidentally built the perfect tool for anonymity, and then they released it to the public. By 2011, Tor had hundreds of thousands of users. Most of them were journalists in authoritarian countries, whistleblowers, activists, people with legitimate reasons to stay hidden. But the same technology that protected a dissident in Iran could protect a drug dealer in San Francisco. Ross Ulbricht understood this, and he had one more piece of the puzzle to add: Bitcoin. Bitcoin had been launched in 2009 by the mysterious Satoshi Nakamoto, a person or group of people whose identity remains unknown to this day. Bitcoin was a digital currency that didn't need a bank, no central authority, no names attached to accounts, just cryptographic addresses, transferring value across the internet like email. When Ross saw Bitcoin, he didn't think, this could make me rich. He thought, this could make commerce free. Put Tor and Bitcoin together, and you had something no one had ever built before. A market that was invisible, a currency that was untraceable, a way for two strangers to exchange money and goods without a single institution in the middle. Ross Ulbricht decided to build it. In early 2010, Ross started coding. He was living in a small house in Austin with a roommate, working odd jobs to pay rent. He had no co-founder, no investors, no office, just his laptop, an idea, and an almost evangelical certainty that what he was building was right. He called it Silk Road, a nod to the ancient trade routes that once connected East and West without government checkpoints, without customs agents, without interference. Trade as old as humanity itself, humans exchanging value with other humans. The concept was simple. Think of it like eBay, but for drugs, running on the dark web. Sellers could list their products, weed, MDMA, cocaine, mushrooms, LSD, and buyers could browse, read reviews, and purchase with Bitcoin. Silk Road would take a commission, between 6% and 10% on each transaction, paid into an escrow account. When the buyer confirmed they'd received their goods, the Bitcoin would be released to the seller. The review system was crucial. Ross was obsessed with it. He believed that transparent feedback would create accountability, that the threat of bad reviews would push sellers toward higher quality and safer products. It was, in a strange and twisted way, a harm reduction strategy. Get your drugs from a reviewed seller with 500 positive ratings, and you were far less likely to get fentanyl-laced garbage from a guy on a street corner. He launched the site in February 2011. It had a handful of listings, almost all of them weed. The first day, almost no one visited. The second day, a few people came. By the end of the first week, a few dozen users had registered. Then, something happened that Ross did not plan for. Gawker found it. In June 2011, journalist Adrian Chen published an article on Gawker titled "The Underground Website Where You Can Buy Any Drug Imaginable." He had been tipped off by a Silk Road user who wanted the world to know this thing existed. The article explained the concept, showed some product listings, and walked through how to access the site. The internet lost its mind. Traffic to Silk Road exploded. Within days, the site had thousands of new users. The number of listings jumped from dozens to hundreds. New sellers poured in. Bitcoin's price spiked, a Silk Road effect that would recur for years. The underground economy had just been handed a megaphone. And in Washington, 2 U.S. senators, Chuck Schumer and Joe Manchin, held a press conference demanding the DEA shut Silk Road down immediately. Ross Ulbricht watched all of this from his laptop. He was terrified, and he was thrilled. He posted in the Silk Road forums under his username, Dread Pirate Roberts, a reference to the movie The Princess Bride, a character who wore a mask and passed his identity from person to person, and he told his community to stay calm. This was the moment. This was what they had been building toward. The world now knew the free market existed. Ross believed, genuinely believed, he was running a revolution. By 2012, Silk Road was the most significant illegal marketplace in history. Its numbers were staggering. At its height, the site had over 900,000 registered users. It was processing tens of millions of dollars in transactions every month. Over 10,000 product listings at any given time. Vendors from dozens of countries, the United States, the UK, the Netherlands, Australia, Canada. The site had its own economy, its own social norms, its own culture. There were forums where users discussed harm reduction, how to test your drugs before taking them, how to recognize contaminated products, when to seek medical help. There were vendor reputation scores, as meticulously maintained as anything on Amazon. There were moderators resolving disputes. There was customer service. Ross, posting as Dread Pirate Roberts, had become a genuine community figure. He wrote long, philosophical essays about liberty, free markets, and the right to self-determination. He answered questions from users. He mediated conflicts. He gave advice to new sellers. He was, in the strange language of the internet, a thought leader, except his platform sold cocaine. The money was incomprehensible. Silk Road's Bitcoin wallet was accumulating hundreds of thousands of coins, worth relatively little at the time, but growing. Ross was living simply, but he was wealthy beyond anything his physics degree had promised him. But he was also running on adrenaline and paranoia in equal measure. The pressure of operating a massive criminal enterprise under federal scrutiny is not something human psychology handles well. Ross began making decisions that a calmer version of himself might have questioned. He developed a mercurial temperament on the forums, warm and philosophical one moment, cold and authoritarian the next. He became obsessed with security. He compiled detailed logs of every administrative decision he made. He kept a journal on his laptop, an extraordinary decision for a man who had everything to hide. He hired staff, moderators, administrators, coders, people he'd only ever met as usernames. He never knew their real names. They never knew his. It was a fully anonymous organization, and it mostly worked. The FBI was not idle. From the moment the Gawker article ran, the agency had been quietly building a task force dedicated to one goal: identifying Dread Pirate Roberts. The problem was that Ross had done almost everything right from an operational security standpoint. His site ran entirely over Tor. Transactions were in Bitcoin. He communicated through encrypted channels. He had no known associates. He had no public profile. He had constructed what cybersecurity experts called an air gap between his online identity and his real one. But the FBI was patient, and it was good at its job. The investigators worked on multiple fronts simultaneously. One team tried to find technical weaknesses in Silk Road's infrastructure. Another worked to flip vendors. Undercover agents bought drugs, collected evidence, and pressured arrested dealers to cooperate. A third team monitored Bitcoin transactions, looking for patterns that might trace the money. And a fourth team did something almost embarrassingly simple. They Googled. In 2013, an FBI agent named Christopher Tarbell made a discovery that would prove pivotal. Working through Silk Road's login page, he found that the site occasionally leaked its real IP address, the actual server location, sitting behind the Tor anonymization layer. It was a small configuration error, the kind of thing a professional web developer would have caught immediately. But Ross wasn't a professional web developer. He was a physicist who had taught himself to code. When that IP address came back, it pointed to a server in Iceland. That was the crack in the wall. Meanwhile, a separate team of IRS agents had been following the Bitcoin trail. One investigator, Gary Alford, had done something no one else had thought to do. He had searched early Bitcoin and dark web forums from 2011, looking for anyone who had promoted a new drug marketplace right around the time Silk Road launched. What he found was a post on a site called Shroomery, a mushroom and psychedelics forum, from a user named Altoid, advertising a new anonymous market. The post was dated January 2011, right before Silk Road launched. And when he dug further, the same username, Altoid, appeared on a Bitcoin talk forum, asking a technical question about a dark web project and linking to an email address. The email address was rossulbricht@gmail.com. Ross Ulbricht had made a mistake so basic, so human, so utterly inconsistent with his otherwise careful construction of anonymity that it almost defied belief. He had used his real name on a public forum while promoting his secret criminal enterprise. One moment of carelessness, 2 years into building something that processed over $1 billion in transactions. The FBI now knew who Dread Pirate Roberts was. What they needed was proof, and they needed to catch him logged into the site so they could seize his laptop before he could close it and trigger an encryption lock. They began to plan the arrest. October 1st, 2013. The Glen Park branch of the San Francisco Public Library. Ross Ulbricht was sitting in his usual spot, near the science fiction section, headphones in, laptop open. He came here often. He liked the quiet. He liked the free Wi-Fi. He was, in many ways, still a graduate student at heart, someone who did his best thinking in libraries. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, he was logged into Silk Road as Dread Pirate Roberts, managing the site, responding to forum posts, handling the daily administrative work of running a drug empire from a public library in San Francisco. He did not notice the 2 FBI agents who had been tracking his movements for weeks. He did not notice when one of them, a woman, walked up behind him. He did not notice when she staged a loud, public argument with a male colleague right next to him, a deliberate distraction. And then, in a single practiced motion, the male agent lunged forward and grabbed the open laptop before Ross could close it. Ross spun around. He grabbed for the laptop, but it was too late. The agents had it, and it was open, unlocked, logged in to Silk Road with administrator privileges, displaying the back-end dashboard of the world's most infamous dark web marketplace. Ross Ulbricht was placed under arrest. He was 29 years old. Within hours, federal agents seized the Silk Road servers. The site went dark. The hundreds of thousands of users who tried to log in that evening saw nothing but a black screen with the FBI seal and a single line of text. This hidden site has been seized. For the users, it was shocking and inevitable in equal measure. Most of them had assumed this day would come eventually. A few cried. Most just quietly moved on to other markets that were already springing up in Silk Road's wake. The underground economy is resilient. It doesn't mourn its fallen platforms, it adapts. The trial of Ross Ulbricht began in January 2015 in the Southern District of New York. It was one of the most technically complex criminal trials in American history, a case that required jurors to understand cryptocurrency, Tor networks, server architecture, and Bitcoin wallets before they could even begin to evaluate the evidence. The government's case was overwhelming. They had his laptop, they had his journal, in which he had documented nearly every major decision he had made as Dread Pirate Roberts. They had hundreds of thousands of messages, transaction records, and administrative logs. They had the Bitcoin wallet, which, by 2015, contained coins worth over $183 million at current prices. The defense tried a novel argument. Ross was not Dread Pirate Roberts. He had created the site, yes, but he had handed it off to someone else early on. The character Dread Pirate Roberts was, as in the movie, a role passed between people. Ross was a fall guy, an unwitting patsy, framed by the real criminal mastermind. The jury didn't buy it. They deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all 7 counts: drug trafficking, continuing a criminal enterprise, money laundering, computer hacking, engaging in a criminal enterprise. The list went on. At sentencing, the judge, Catherine Forrest, had one more piece of information to consider. The government had charged Ross with soliciting murder. During his time running Silk Road, when he believed a former employee was threatening to expose him, Ross had allegedly paid $80,000 in Bitcoin to have the man killed. The murder was never carried out. The FBI agent posing as a hitman had taken the money and reported back, and the charge was never proven at trial. But Judge Forrest said it weighed on her. She sentenced Ross Ulbricht to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His mother, Lynn Ulbricht, collapsed in tears. Ross, who had spent the weeks before sentencing writing a letter to the judge begging for leniency, stood very still. He did not cry. People who were in the courtroom that day say he looked as though he had known, somewhere deep down, that this was always how it would end. But the Silk Road story doesn't end with Ross Ulbricht in handcuffs, because even as the FBI celebrated its takedown, a different kind of rot was spreading through the investigation. 2 of the federal agents involved in bringing down Silk Road were, themselves, stealing from it. Sean Bridges was a Secret Service agent and cryptocurrency expert who had been one of the key technical investigators on the Silk Road Task Force. He had used his access to Silk Road systems and his knowledge of how Bitcoin worked to steal 20,000 Bitcoin from the site. In 2015, that was worth about $820,000. Today, it would be worth well over $1 billion. Carl Force was a DEA agent who had gone even further. Under the username Knob, Force had cultivated a relationship with Dread Pirate Roberts over months, posing as a drug cartel associate who wanted to do business. In the process, he sold Ross confidential information about the investigation, including, allegedly, the identity of a cooperating witness. He also extorted Ross directly, threatening to expose the site unless he was paid. He received over $700,000 in Bitcoin payments through various aliases. Force also tried to sell information to a third-party journalist. He set up fake identities. He laundered money. He created shell companies. He was, by any measure, one of the most corrupt law enforcement agents in recent American history. Both men were caught. Bridges was sentenced to nearly 6 years in prison. Force was sentenced to 6.5 years. Both were out in a fraction of their sentences. Ross Ulbricht is still in prison. He is serving life without parole, while the agents who stole from his platform served a handful of years and went home. Whatever you think about what Ross built, and reasonable people disagree violently about it, the disparity is hard to look at without feeling something uncomfortable. Here is where things get genuinely complicated. Because Silk Road was not simply a drug bazaar, it was also a test case for a series of ideas that criminologists, economists, and public health researchers have been debating for a decade. A 2013 study in the journal Harm Reduction found that Silk Road users reported safer drug use practices than street market buyers. They reported higher quality products, more consistent dosing, and, crucially, less exposure to violence. The researchers noted that buying drugs on Silk Road eliminated the need for a face-to-face transaction in a potentially dangerous environment. A suburban teenager in Iowa who bought ecstasy on Silk Road never had to meet a dealer, never had to walk into a neighborhood that scared them, never had to establish an ongoing relationship with someone in the criminal economy. A 2014 study in the Carnegie Mellon Journal of Law and Policy estimated that Silk Road had displaced a significant portion of street drug sales in certain markets, which, depending on your framework, was either reducing harm or simply moving it online. The site famously refused to list certain products. Stolen credit cards were prohibited. Weapons were prohibited, with an exception for firearms that was quietly removed after community backlash. But most significantly, Ross refused to allow listings for child pornography or anything that could be used to harm non-consenting parties. The guiding philosophy was harm reduction, not harm elimination. You could buy drugs for yourself. You could not buy tools to hurt someone else. These are not easy ideas to sit with, because the harm reduction argument requires you to accept a premise that much of society explicitly rejects, that people have the right to choose what they put in their bodies, even when those choices are dangerous. It requires you to weigh the violence of prohibition against the violence of addiction. It requires you to have an honest conversation about who drug laws actually protect and who they harm. Ross believed he was having that conversation. Whether or not he was right, he was certainly not the first person to ask the questions. When Silk Road went dark in October 2013, the vacuum it left was filled almost immediately. Silk Road 2.0 launched within weeks, run by former Silk Road moderators. It was seized by the FBI in November 2014. Alphabay rose in its place, becoming significantly larger than Silk Road had ever been, processing over $600,000 in daily transactions at its peak. It was taken down in 2017 in a joint operation between the FBI, DEA, and Europol. Its founder, Alexandre Kaz, was found dead in a Thai prison cell 4 days after his arrest. His death was ruled a suicide. Hansa Market was taken down in the same operation. Dream Market followed. Empire Market exit scammed its users out of $30 million. The cycle continues. Each marketplace that falls is replaced by a new one. The technology has evolved dramatically. Better operational security, more sophisticated cryptocurrency mixing, decentralized platforms that don't have a central server to seize. The war between law enforcement and dark web markets has been, from the federal government's perspective, extraordinarily expensive and only partially successful. The markets keep coming back. Ross Ulbricht's case became a cause célèbre for a certain segment of the libertarian and cryptocurrency communities. His mother, Lynn Ulbricht, became a tireless advocate for his release, speaking at conferences, writing articles, building a coalition of people who believed his sentence was disproportionate. The hashtag #FreeRoss movement gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures on petitions. Several prominent figures, from tech entrepreneurs to politicians, argued publicly that life without parole for a non-violent drug offense was an act of judicial cruelty.
And really, people deserve a second chance. Putting people in jail and throwing away the key was wrong for Matthew Charles. It's wrong for Russ Ulbricht, and he's going to get a second chance in life, and I think people do deserve that.
In January 2025, after years of advocacy, President Donald Trump, in one of his final acts before leaving office, commuted Ross Ulbricht's sentence. After more than a decade behind bars, Ross Ulbricht walked out of federal prison.
Last night, Donald Trump granted me a full pardon.
His first public statement was brief. He thanked his family. He thanked his supporters. He said he was looking forward to seeing the world. The internet celebrated, argued, and dissected the decision for days. Some people called it justice. Others called it an outrage. Most people probably had a complicated reaction that lived somewhere between those two poles. So what do we make of Ross Ulbricht? What do we make of Silk Road? Here is the honest answer. It depends on what you believe about the relationship between law, freedom, and harm. If you believe that the state has the right and the obligation to protect citizens from the consequences of their own choices, then Silk Road was a dangerous criminal enterprise run by a man who facilitated addiction, overdose, and death on a massive scale. The government's case was correct. The sentence was severe, but severity was warranted. If you believe that consenting adults have the right to make their own choices about their bodies, and that prohibition creates more harm than it prevents, then Ross Ulbricht was a principled idealist who built something genuinely useful, who reduced violence, improved drug quality, and created a market where harm reduction was a feature, not a bug, and who was sentenced to die in prison for it. Most of us, honestly, live somewhere in the middle. We're not libertarian enough to endorse the free market in heroin, but we're not naive enough to pretend that drug prohibition has been a success story. We watch Netflix documentaries about the fentanyl crisis and the opioid epidemic and the prison industrial complex, and we think something is broken here. We're just not sure what the fix is. What Ross Ulbricht built was not the fix, but it was a symptom of the same brokenness. A signal that millions of people are determined to access substances that the state has declared illegal, and that they will find ever more sophisticated ways to do so, regardless of the legal consequences. The dark web marketplaces didn't create demand for drugs. The demand was already there. They just reorganized it. The technology that powered Silk Road, Tor, Bitcoin, end-to-end encryption, is now used by hundreds of millions of people for entirely legitimate purposes. Journalists use Tor to protect sources. Bitcoin has become a mainstream asset. Encryption is how your bank protects your money. Ross Ulbricht built his empire on infrastructure that is now considered essential digital rights technology. That's the strange double helix at the center of this story. The tools of a drug empire became the tools of a free internet. The ideals of a criminal became the language of a civil liberties movement. The site that sold ecstasy to college students helped establish, in legal precedent and public consciousness, that online anonymity was worth protecting. There were real victims in this story. People who bought drugs on Silk Road and overdosed. Families who lost someone. The fact that those deaths might have happened anyway, through street markets or prescription pills or any number of other vectors, doesn't make them less real or less tragic. There was also a young man who built something extraordinary from nothing, who held a genuine philosophical conviction, who was not violent, and who is spending the rest of his life, or spent over a decade, in federal prison, while the corrupt agents who robbed his platform are already free. You can hold both of those things at once. In fact, I think you have to.
Ross Ulbricht is free now. The Silk Road is gone, replaced, superseded, scattered across 100 successor platforms, 1,000 encrypted channels, 1 million anonymous transactions happening right now, at this moment, in the dark corners of the internet where no FBI agent will ever find them. The war on drugs continues. The dark web marketplaces continue. The Bitcoin blockchain keeps growing. And somewhere, right now, there is probably a 25-year-old in a dorm room, or a coffee shop, or a library, reading about Silk Road and thinking, I could do it better. I could do it smarter. I could build something that doesn't leave an IP address in Iceland, or post with a Gmail account on a mushroom forum. And maybe they're right. Maybe they'll build something more resilient, more anonymous, harder to crack. Or maybe they'll make one small mistake, a single carelessly typed email address, a moment of human weakness in a sea of encrypted caution, and one day they'll be sitting in a library with their laptop open, and someone will grab it before they can close the lid. That's the lesson Ross Ulbricht probably couldn't have learned in advance, and can never unlearn now. You can build the most sophisticated anonymous empire in the history of the internet. You can route your traffic through a dozen countries. You can encrypt every byte. You can use a pseudonym borrowed from a beloved film, but you are still a human being, and human beings make mistakes, and one mistake is all it takes. If you made it this far, hit the follow button, because this is the kind of story I live to tell. The ones where nothing is clean. Nobody is purely a hero or a villain, and the truth lives somewhere in the uncomfortable space in between. I'll see you in the next one.